This is our last week looking at the theme of worship, and this week's Bible reading comes from Matthew chapter 14, and I'm going to start reading at verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Worship is such a huge subject, and tonight I just want to look at three aspects of worship from this passage. And the first one I want to look at is the fact that Jesus wanted to find some time to pray in solitude on his own. It's quite remarkable, isn't it, that Jesus, who we know exercises the power of Almighty God, is Almighty God, and yet he prays earnestly and at length throughout his ministry to God the Father. Jesus is the divine Son of God, to whom all authority is given. He does mighty deeds, and yet he consistently submits to the will of the Father. There must have been something quite remarkable about Jesus' prayer life, because the disciples at a different point say to Jesus, "Lord, teach us to pray." They wanted to pray like Jesus prayed. But there comes a point, perhaps for all of us, when actually what we want is solitude, and we want time alone with God. And Jesus shows us that type of worship, that type of communion with God. Perhaps we can think about times when we have found solitude with God to be more appropriate than being in a group and praying in that way. I'm not sure why that is, but Jesus gives us this pattern that worshipping in solitude has its place, to be alone with God. The second thing that happens with worship in this passage is something I want to look at from a different way to normal, and that is Peter walking on the water. It appears to me that Peter worships Jesus in his actions, because he takes God at his word and he steps out of the boat into the storm. That is quite an amazing thing. Walking on the water would, in Jewish heritage and pagan religions, be seen as something that only the gods could do. And so here is Jesus coming, walking on the water. So here's Peter, while the storm is raging, he takes God at his word and acts and asks and acts. He gets out of the boat and walks on the water. I just wanted to think about, how do we worship God in our daily lives? Do we take God at his word? Do we live our lives looking for God to act and to live in faith? How do we see worship working out in our everyday lives as we're driving our cars, as we're making decisions about what to do? Some years ago, quite a few people joined the "What Would Jesus Do" movement, because they wanted to see that in every area of their lives, they wanted to live lives of worship. And the last piece of worship is the disciples worship Jesus because of the miraculous things he has done. So they've seen Jesus walking on the water. They have seen him save Peter. They see him get in the boat, and the storm calms down. So their conclusion is that Jesus is really the Son of God. This phrase perhaps first means that Jesus is God's promised king, the great Son of David. Certainly quite what the disciples are affirming, we don't quite know. And maybe some questions and doubts remain that they will sort out in the future, because the truth is that none of us know all the answers. But we just look at Jesus, and we look at what Jesus has done and what he's doing, and we bring him our worship as response to that. Perhaps we have seen something in the last week that encourages us to worship. What is it that encourages us to worship Jesus today?